author of one of the best books ever written on money, The Psychology of Money. Now, this is where he speaks about the behavioral finance using storytelling to explore how investors deal with risk, as well as how we can think about risk in a more productive way. And today, he will actually share valuable lessons on wealth, greed, and happiness. He is a partner at the Collaborator Fund and a former columnist at the Motley Fool and the Wall Street Journal as well. And let me also inform you, he's a two-time winner of the Best in Business Award from Society of American Business Editors and Writers, winner of the New York Times Sydney Award, and two-time finalist of the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism. I think we're truly, truly delighted and honored to have the presence of Morgan Housel, who's the author of the book, The Psychology of Money. So on that note, I think it has to be, as we call it, we save the best for the last. So with that, let's get the session started, featuring none other than Mr. Morgan Housel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Good evening for you. Good morning for me. It's very early in the United States, but I'm happy to be able to do this. I'm glad that during this crazy year, when we can't see each other in person, we can still do these events like this. But it is certainly the craziest year that I've experienced in my investing career. And I think as a fan of financial history, probably the craziest, the wildest, the most unprecedented year in the global economy in modern times, maybe going back to World War II and the Great Depression. I think what we've experienced in the last 12 months exceeds anyone's expectations of what we thought we would expect as investors and in the economy. As if you went back 1 year ago, 2 years ago, I was in India. If you had asked me what I expect in the economy, I would have said that I expected surprises and I would have expected bear markets and volatility. But what we have experienced in the last 12 months is truly unprecedented. And I want to talk today about a phrase that has become very important to me over the last 12 months as I try to make out what has happened with COVID-19. And that phrase is realistic optimism. And what I mean by realistic optimism is this. If you are an optimist and you think that everything is going to be okay in the world, that's actually not an optimist. That is actually a complacent. You are being complacent. If you think everything is going to be okay in the world, you are just being complacent. What a realistic optimist is this. A realistic optimist knows that the short term, what's going to happen in any given month, any given year, any given decade is going to be a continuous chain, a constant chain of setbacks and disappointments and challenges and recessions and bear markets and pandemics. But you are still an optimist because you know that dealing with all of those setbacks in the short term does not preclude long-term growth. A realistic optimist is someone who knows that the short term is going to be a mess, but the long term is still okay. That is what a realistic optimist is. So as I sit here today in 2021, I can look around the world and see that it is a mess. Unemployment is off the charts. We're still dealing with the virus in huge numbers. We really don't know what's going to happen next in terms of inflation or when the economy is going to reopen. So that's the realistic part of understanding how bad it is. But the optimist in me, it does not have any less optimism than I did a year ago or 2 years ago about our ability to create value over the long run, for businesses to solve problems, for businesses to become more productive, to accrue profits to investors over time. That has not changed whatsoever. I'm as optimistic about the future today as I ever have been. So I want to talk today a little bit about the psychology of money, which is not what the market's going to do next or what the economy might do next. I just want to tell you a couple of stories today about what happens inside of our head when we try to think about money, when we try to think about greed and risk and happiness. And these stories, I think, these three stories that I want to share with you today are very relevant to what has happened in the last year with COVID-19. And the first story I want to talk to you about today actually has nothing to do with investing whatsoever. It's a story about, let me click here. The story is about risk is what you don't see. And I want to tell you a story about this guy. Harry Houdini, one of the most famous magicians of all time. Harry Houdini, of course, who did his work, most of his work in the United States about 100 years ago. And Harry Houdini, the magician, was famous. He was most known for his escapes. As you would see here, he would tie himself in chains, or he would tie himself in a straitjacket and throw himself in the river, and he could escape, and he would find his way out. He would escape virtually anything when he did this. Now, Harry Houdini actually had another act that he would perform on stage. He was not as famous as his escapes, but a trick that he did on stage during every presentation that the audiences loved was at the end of every show, he would stand on stage, he would invite the largest, strongest man onto stage, and he would tell that man to punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. Harry Houdini would stand there and he would flex his muscles and the man would punch him in the stomach, and crowds loved this. They had a different sense of humor back then, maybe than we do today. But Harry Houdini's claim to fame was that he could flex his stomach in a way that could absorb the strongest man's punches. Now, one day after a show in 1922, Harry Houdini went back to his dressing room after the show, and he invited a group of college students back there to meet him. One of the college students' name was Robert Whitehead, and Robert Whitehead walked up to Harry Houdini, and he started punching him in the stomach as hard as he could. He didn't mean any harm. He wasn't trying to hurt Harry Houdini. He just thought he was performing the same trick that he had just seen on stage. Now, Harry Houdini was not prepared to be punched. He fell to the ground in pain. He said, "What are you doing?" Robert Whitehead said, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Houdini. I didn't mean any harm. I just thought I was performing the same trick that I just saw." Harry Houdini told Robert Whitehead he was not prepared to be punched, so he was not flexing his stomach muscles like he did on stage, and now he was in a lot of pain. Harry Houdini woke up the next morning, doubled over in pain. His appendix had ruptured, almost certainly from Robert Whitehead's punches the day before, and Harry Houdini died later that day. This was how he died. And what I think is so interesting about this and so relevant about this is that Harry Houdini could survive virtually anything in the world. He could tie himself up in chains and throw himself in a river, and he could survive that because he was prepared for it. He knew what was going to happen. He had a plan for it. The one thing that he did not see coming, just this college student's punch to his gut, is actually what killed him. And what I think is so important about this is this. How risky something is depends on whether you are prepared for it. Not how dangerous it looks, not how big of a risk it looks, not how much damage you think it's going to occur, but just whether you are prepared for it or whether it is a surprise. And that is also true in investing. That is also true in the economy. What's true in the economy that we learned so well in the last year is that the biggest economic risk is what no one is talking about. Because if no one is talking about it, no one is prepared for it. And if no one is prepared for it, its damage will be amplified when it arrives. Let me show you what I mean. We spent over the last decade, the better part of the last decade, debating in the investment community and the economic community what the biggest economic risk was that we faced in the world. During the last decade, what was the biggest economic risk in the world? And we tend to personify these risks. So we asked ourselves, was this guy the biggest risk to the economy? Was it Barack Obama and the stimulus packages and the tax hikes of 2013? Was that the biggest risk to the economy? Was it this guy? Was it Ben Bernanke? Was it the former chairman of the Federal Reserve who was printing so much money after the financial crisis? Was he the biggest risk? Was it this guy? Was it Donald Trump and the erratic policies of the last 4 years, the trade wars of the last 4 years? Was that the biggest risk to the economy? Was he the biggest risk? And now we know in hindsight that the answer to this question was none of these three guys. None of these three guys were the biggest risk to the economy. The biggest risk by far was this guy. It was a virus that no one was talking about. No one had even mentioned. It was not on anyone's forecast and anyone's analyst report until the moment that it started wreaking havoc. And I think if you look historically at what actually moves the needle in the economy, you see this again and again, that the biggest risk is what no one is talking about. You know, if you look historically, the biggest risks that people talk about are things like trade wars and next quarter's earnings and budget deficit forecasts and elections. And it's not that these things aren't risky. It's that everyone knows that they're going to happen. They're not surprises to anyone. But if you look historically, what actually moves the needle, what actually is the biggest risk in hindsight, it's things like COVID-19. It's things like Lehman Brothers couldn't find a buyer in 2008, which started the financial crisis. September the 11th, the terrorist attacks, Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into World War II. Those are the actual risks that move the needle in the world. And the common denominator between these risks is that no one saw them coming. No one was talking about them until the moment that they arrived. Now, I think this can be kind of disheartening for people to think about, that risk is what you don't see. But I think there's two things to think about that can help you wrap your head around this topic in a better way. And the first one here is to think about risk in the economy the way that California thinks about earthquakes, which is having expectations versus forecasts. What I mean by that is this. If you live in California, you know that earthquakes are going to be a part of your future. There's no question about it. But you don't know when the next earthquake is going to come. You don't know where it's going to hit. You don't know how big it's going to be. You can't forecast when the next earthquake's going to come. No one can do that. And people know that. So rather than trying to forecast when the earthquake's going to come, people just have an expectation that earthquakes are going to be part of their future, and then they might arrive at any moment. They're always prepared for one to arrive at any moment. So the firefighters, the emergency crews are always prepared for it to happen at any given moment, rather than trying to forecast when it might happen. Thinking about economic risk in the economy and the stock market, I think in the same way is the best way that we can think about risk. Look, if I were to say, hypothetically, the next recession will occur in Q2 of 2022, I'm just making that up. That's a forecast. But if I were to say, historically, there have been about 2 recessions per decade, that's an expectation. And I think just having that expectation of being prepared for it to happen at any moment is a much better way to think about risk in this world where the biggest risk is what we don't see coming. The second thing to think about here on this topic that's so important is the difference between getting rich and staying rich. They are two completely different skills that require different traits that need to be nurtured on their own. Getting rich requires swinging for the fences, being an optimist, being optimistic about the future, taking some risk. That's what getting rich requires. Staying rich requires almost the exact opposite. It requires a degree of conservatism and paranoia about the short term. An acknowledgement, as I said earlier, that the short term is a constant chain of disappointments and setbacks and recessions and bear markets and pandemics that you need to survive and be able to endure these short-term setbacks and able to enjoy the compounding and the wealth that comes from your long-term optimism. So that's the first story that I want to talk to you about today. The second story is that timing is meaningless, but time is everything. And this too is a story that has nothing to do with investing. I want to tell you a story about this. Most of you will recognize what this picture is. This is the first second of the first flight in human history. December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk in the United States. And it's hard to overstate how important this moment was, because the airplane went on to change everything in the world. It completely changed geopolitics. It completely changed the economy. It changed transportation, communication. It started world wars. The airplane ended world wars. There was not a single part of the world that was not changed after this moment. And what's so great about this moment is that you don't need any scientific knowledge to understand how big a deal this was. This was not like mapping the genome where you need a scientific background to kind of understand its significance. This was just a man flying through the sky like a bird. And even if you were a child watching this moment, you could have understood that this was a big deal. So you can imagine how exciting this moment was, and how journalists and newspapers all started writing stories about how the world was changed forever now that man had conquered the airplane. Except that is not at all what happened next. This I want to show you. This is the front page from the New York Times on December 17th, 1903, the day the Wright brothers first flew. And it's small print, but you can take my word for it. There's no mention of the Wright brothers' first flight in there anywhere. No mention of the first flight. This is the next day, December 18th. No mention whatsoever. And the 19th, and the 20th, and the 21st. No mention of what the Wright brothers were doing. By this time, the Wright brothers had flown about a dozen times. One of their flights lasted for 59 seconds, and there's no mention in the New York Times anywhere about what they were doing. This went on for weeks. It went on for months. It went on for years. 2 years after the Wright brothers first flew, the New York Times did an interview with a German hot air balloon tycoon, as you see here. And they asked this German hot air balloon tycoon whether humans would ever fly, whether they would ever fly in an airplane. They called them flying machines back there. And the German hot air balloon tycoon said, quote, "In the very, 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 very far future, there may be flying machines, but not now, not now." So this is 2 years after the Wright brothers first flew. And the largest newspaper in the country didn't even know that they had done it yet. Now, it turns out that there was one newspaper that covered the Wright brothers' first flight. It was the Dayton Herald. The Wright brothers were from Dayton, Ohio. And this is how they covered it, the Wright brothers' first flight. And I love how it's just framed here. It says, "Dayton boys solve problem." Like, it's just a silly science experiment that a couple kids did that didn't have any significance at all in the world. Now, the editor of this newspaper, the guy who wrote this story, was a guy named Luther Beard. And Luther Beard was asked many years later why he was the only journalist in the world to cover the Wright brothers' first flight. And Luther Beard said, quote, "I used to chat with them, the Wright brothers, in a friendly way because I sort of felt sorry for them. They seemed like well-meaning, decent enough young men, yet there they were wasting their time day after day on that ridiculous flying machine." So the only journalist in the world to cover the Wright brothers' first flight did it out of sympathy for these poor kids. Now, after Kitty Hawk, where the Wright brothers first flew, the Wright brothers went back to Dayton, Ohio. And Dayton is really where they really mastered flying. And Dayton was a very populated city during this period. And they were flying all over people's homes and over people's businesses. They were flying through the middle of town. David McCullough wrote a great biography of the Wright brothers where he talks about this period back in Dayton. And he writes, quote, "Not one reporter bothered to attend during this time, nor did public interest increase. With few exceptions, there seemed to be no public interest at all. No local excitement or curiosity or sense of wonder over the miraculous thing happening right in Dayton's own backyard." Now, of course, in due time, the Wright brothers got the credit and the recognition that they deserved for building the airplane. But it took years. It took them 5 years to build the airplane, and then another 5 years for them to get any credit, for people to recognize what they were doing. And what's interesting about this is that if you think about the traits of successful entrepreneurs, you think about things like creativity and ingenuity, your engineering ability, things like that. Rarely do you think about time horizon and patience as a competitive advantage. But for the Wright brothers, it absolutely was. Or to the extent that we think about patience as a competitive advantage, we often massively underestimate how much time is needed to put the odds of success in our favor. And that is also true in investing. Let me show you what I mean. What this shows is going back to the 1870s, the maximum and the minimum annual returns that you could have earned in the stock market based off of holding period. So if you held stocks for 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, what's the most you could have earned on an annualized basis and the least you could have earned on an annualized basis? That's what this shows here. And two things should stick out here that are very important. One is that it scales down perfectly over time. So the longer you hold stocks, the more likely you are to converge on just a pretty good return. But the more important thing that should stick out here is that it is not until between 10 and 20 years that every holding period finishes with a positive return. Not a good return, just a positive return. And this is important because if you ask most investors, are you a long-term investor? Most investors will tell you, yes, they are a long-term investor. But then if you ask them, what is the definition of long-term? A lot of investors will tell you 1 year, that's the long term. Maybe 5 years, that's the long run. 10 years is definitely the long run. Even if we know a pretty good definition of what the long term is, the definition being just every holding period finishes with a positive return, is something between 10 and 20 years. It's much longer than people tend to think. Now, this also has a big impact on how we think about compounding, which is, of course, the rocket fuel in investing. What this chart shows is Warren Buffett's net worth over the course of his life. From the time he was age 14 to today, where he's about age 90, this is his net worth over the course of his life. And what should really stick out here that is so astounding to me is that 99% of Warren Buffett's net worth came after his 50th birthday. And 97% came after his 65th birthday. If Warren Buffett had retired at age 60, like a normal person might, you would have never heard of him. The reason he's so successful, what has actually generated the amount of wealth that he has today, that's made him one of the richest men in the world, is because he's been investing for 80 years. Now, this is so important because if we go and analyze how Warren Buffett has been so successful, as a lot of investors do, They will dig into how he thinks about business models and moats and market cycles and management teams, which are all important topics. But the reason Warren Buffett has been so successful, just as a matter of simple arithmetic, is because he's been investing for 80 years. He is a great investor, of course, but his secret is time. It's the amount of time that he has been investing for. I think we have to remind ourselves that when progress is measured generationally, results should not be measured quarterly. And the central problem that investors have in the stock market, and this has been so true in the last year as well, is underestimating the amount of time that is necessary to put the odds of success in our favor. And the single most important thing that we can do as investors is to increase the amount of time that we are investing for and able to improve our investing returns over time. And now the last story I want to talk to you about today is that you can be wrong half the time and still do great. This too is a story that has nothing to do with investing. I want to tell you a story about baby brain development. The average child is born with about 100 billion brain neurons, and each one of those neurons has about 3,000 synaptic connections, which are these connections to other neurons that forms this web of intelligence inside of your brain. Maybe when their baby is born, that web looks something like this. By the time the average child is 6 months old, that has increased from 3,000 to 6,000 synaptic connections. So just the density of knowledge in your brain is growing very quickly. By age 2, that's increased from 6,000 to 10,000 synaptic connections. So in the first 2 years, the web of knowledge in your life just grows exponentially, and you form this big, dense web of knowledge inside of your head. And then after 2 years, something very interesting happens, which is that the number of synaptic connections in your head does not just peak and plateau, it starts to decline, and it declines fairly rapidly. By the time the average child is 4 years old, they've already lost about 1/5 of the synaptic connections that they had when they were 2. By the time the average child is 6, they've lost about 1/3 of the connections in their brain that they had when they were 2 years old. This continues all throughout your childhood and adolescence into your early adulthood. By the time the average person is 25 years old, they have lost half of the synaptic connections that they had in their brain when they were 2 years old. Why does this happen? Well, it turns out that a lot of the learning that takes place in your early years is learning that is redundant, that is not necessary, learning in your head that is inefficiently wired. Sometimes it is completely miswired. There's evidence, particularly in the first few moments of a newborn baby's life, that some newborn babies can hear colors and smell sounds because the part of their brain that is processing that information is just completely miswired. So we go through a lot of the early years of our life getting rid of these inefficient, unnecessary connections in our brain. But what's important about this is that even though what's going on inside of your head is chaos and loss and destruction, you're still getting smarter. A 4-year-old is much smarter than a 2-year-old. And a 20-year-old is much smarter than a 4-year-old, most of the time at least. But this idea that you can get smarter over time, you can improve over time, even though what's going on inside of your head is chaos and loss and destruction, is not very intuitive, but we see it in a lot of fields. And one of the fields we see it very often in is in investing. Let me show you what I mean. This is the Russell 3000, an index of US stocks going back to 1980. And this is kind of the picture of success. This is an average annual return of 12% per year. This is like as good as it gets for a large nation stock market. But if you look at what went on inside of the index during this period, how these 3,000 companies actually performed during this period, you get a completely different view. You will see that the median stock in the index underperformed the average by 54 percentage points. 40% of the components in this index lost money during this 40-year period. Not because they merged or went out of business or bought out, but because they went out of business. They went bankrupt. 40% of the companies in this index during this period. Virtually all of the return in this index comes from 7% of companies that had extraordinary returns. So here again, you start with something that's done very well over time, the picture of success. But then you look at what went on inside of this index, and it is a constant chain of chaos and loss and destruction. And this has a big impact on how we think about volatility as investors as well. This is the S&P 500 in the United States going back to 1957, its inception in 1957. And this is like as good as it gets for a large nation stock market. If we can repeat this performance over the next 60 years, that's as good as anyone can hope for. But this I want to show you is when the market was down 5% from its previous all-time high. That's when it's down 10% from the previous all-time high. And that's when it's down 20% or more from the previous all-time high. So you start with the picture of success, as good as it gets, but then you layer on the nuance of what happened during this period, and it's a completely different view. And what's important about this is that at every one of the bars on this chart, you have investors all over the world who say, this doesn't feel right, this feels wrong, this can't be how it's supposed to work, the market feels broken, and so I want out. And so they sell, thinking that they have discovered something that can't be right, that has to be broken, even if this is just a long-term normal path of how growth works over time. And this is accentuated, of course, if you are a stock picker, if you're picking individual stocks. This is Netflix stock from 2002 to 2018. I just grossly cherry-picked the best returns that I could find from a large cap company. This is truly as good as it gets if you are a stock picker. You made 400 times your money during this period. But this is the losses that you had to endure in percentage terms to achieve those returns over time. And this is why the percentage of investors who actually hold Netflix stock for this 16-year period rounds to zero. Constant chain of chaos and loss and destruction, but that is a normal path of how growth works over time. Of course, we saw this last year when in March of last year, the market fell 35 or 40% in the course of a couple of weeks. But now, of course, it's rebounded so much so quickly, and here we are back at all-time highs again. And one of my favorite quotes is from Napoleon, who was once asked the definition of the military genius. And Napoleon said, a military genius is the man who can do the average thing when everyone else around him is losing his mind. And I think it's the exact same in investing. Like, good investing is not about making great decisions. It's about consistently not making mistakes, consistently not screwing up, and consistently not reacting to the chaos and loss and destruction of the short run that will pull you away from an investing strategy that is likely to earn the highest returns. Charlie Munger has a great quote that summarizes this, where he says, the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And so now, if there is a common denominator about these stories today, it's that when people think about risk, they tend to think about what is going to happen to them. What's going to happen to me? What is the stock market going to do to me? What's the economy going to do to me? I often think a much better way to think about risk is just what we do to ourselves. It's our own biases, our own misconceptions, anchoring to our own unique histories and our own biases. And that can be kind of hard for people to hear, that you are your own worst enemy in investing. But I honestly think it's the most optimistic realization in investing. Because of course, we have no control over what the stock market's going to do next. We have no control over what the economy is going to do next. The only thing we have control over in investing is our own behavior. And when you realize that your own behavior is the most important aspect of investing, that's actually a pretty optimistic realization. So I want to end with you today with a quote from a great investor who I really admire, named Bill Bonner, who says, people do not get what they want or what they expect from markets. They get what they deserve. So thank you very much for listening today. I think we have some time for Q&A, but thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, Morgan, thank you so much. And that was such a wonderful presentation. And I've been a great admirer of your work. I've read this book, Psychology of Money, and I think I've bought about 12 to 15 copies and shared it with people that I care about.
Well, thank you very much. That's very meaningful to me. And
yes.
Thank you very much for having me.
Happy coincidence, around the time when I read the book and raving about it, and we were planning on this conference and who to call, who to approach. And I was so thrilled when you agreed to speak at our conference.
Well, it's absolutely an honor to be here.
I want you to know that.
Thank you very much.
Now, this book is full of insights. It makes us realize many things. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is that there's a gap between realization and action. You just quoted so many things. I remember the one which you where you quoted Napoleon. He said, just do the average thing when other people are losing their mind. Now, how do we? Realization is one thing, putting it into action is yet another. As a behavioral finance expert, you would agree with me that to just, how do we condition our minds? Because from whatever you said today in your presentation, from whatever I could gather from the book, it's all about the mind.
That's right. And there's a quote, there's a great quote from Warren Buffett who says, be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. Yes. And it is much easier to say that, to quote it, than to actually do it. And I think it is so important for investors to realize that fact. And here's how I think people should really get around that. It's just you have to be introspective about who you are personally and realize your own risk tolerances, your own personalities, your own biases, your own quirks, and embrace who you are. Rather than thinking that you can be Warren Buffett, than thinking you can be George Soros, than thinking you can be David Tepper, realize that you are you. I am me. We're all different. We have very different risk tolerances. And you have to be introspective about your own behavior and look back and say, how did I react as an investor in March of 2020? What did I do? How did I react in 2008 when the world was falling apart? What did I do then? What did I do in 1999 if I was investing back then? During these big moments of upheaval, when the world feels like it's falling apart, what was your behavior? And embrace that how you reacted during those moments is how you are likely to react in the future. The best indication of your future behavior is your past behavior, because those are the moments when you're breaking away from the textbook of what you want to do, the Warren Buffett quotes, from who you actually are and what your personality is. So I think if you look back at just who you are and how you've behaved and create an investing strategy around that. Look, I'm a professional investor. I do this for a living, but I've realized over the years that I have a slightly lower risk tolerance than other investors do. Not massively different, but I just, rather than trying to fix that or assuming that I can be someone who I'm not, I just embrace that. And my asset allocation kind of accepts that. It's not as aggressive as other people's, and that's fine. It's not because I don't understand risk. It's because I understand myself. And so people just need to embrace who they are and accept their flaws rather than trying to be someone else and learning from those people.
Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you is it possible for other people to train you so that your mind is conditioned in a much better way? I'll use the analogy of a physiotherapist. Sometimes you dislocate your arm and then you go to a physiotherapist and they kind of work around your body. They make you do exercises and then you're back to normal again. Is it possible for, say, a behavioral expert, a scientist, subject matter specialist like you to collaborate with a behavioral sciences, psychiatrist or whatever, psychotherapist, and help people train their minds much better?
I think there's two things to think about here. One is that it's absolutely possible and in fact critical and vital for people to understand and learn about the history of volatility, the history of market cycles, the history of upheaval, so that you can better contextualize what's going on in the world. That's absolutely critical. So to that extent, can we learn about market history? Can we learn about biases? Yes. But as I said earlier, people can't change the hormones in their head. You can't read a book or read some Excel spreadsheet and change the amount of dopamine and cortisol that's in your brain. You can't fix that. So I think we can better contextualize what's going on in the world, but we can't fix who we are fundamentally. So I've learned so much from other investors. And when I speak with my investing friends, I learn so much about the world that helps me better contextualize what's going on today. If you learn about things like World War II or the or flu pandemics that happened 100 years ago, you can better contextualize what's happening in the world today. But does that mean that you're not going to panic last March when the world was falling apart? No, it does not preclude that whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So I think you can help around the edges for understanding how risk works. But at the end of the day, we're all different. We all have different hormones in our head that are going to influence us to do different things. So it's absolutely critical that you try to work with other people, a financial advisor, other investors. You speak with other people, whether it's just reading books on your own or speaking with a financial advisor. But we all have to accept that people have different risk tolerances that need to be adhered to.
Okay, and one of the things that from your book, I wanted to ask you and to actually explain. I've read the book, but I thought our audience would benefit if you could tell us, why do you believe that reasonable decisions could produce better results than rational decisions? Because till I had read your book, I had assumed that, we were our worst enemies and hence we needed to be completely rational. Your book says no. Actually, it's fine to be human. It's fine to be reasonable. Okay, you're not expected to.
It's this idea that people don't make financial decisions on a spreadsheet. They make financial decisions at the dinner table. When they're speaking with their spouse, speaking with their kids, that's when people make financial decisions. So we should not pretend that you can make things really cleanly in terms of just the best financial decision is 2 + 2 = 4, and it's the same number for everyone. Everyone's family is different. Everyone's risk tolerance is different. Everyone has different goals, different personalities. And therefore, rather than thinking that there's one right rational answer for everyone, we should just embrace that equally educated and informed people can and do come to different conclusions. And therefore, if there is a financial decision that doesn't look rational, but it's reasonable for you and it makes you happy and it's moving you towards you and your family goals, that's the right thing to do. Here's one that I talk about in the book. There's a well-documented home bias in investing where the investors in the United States only own US stocks. Indian investors only own Indian stocks. German investors only own German stocks, more or less. And it's not rational whatsoever. It's not rational to think that the best investments that you can own are the ones that are nearest your home. There's no way to rationalize that, but it's actually a very reasonable thing to do. Because if owning companies that you are familiar with, and you're familiar with them because they are close to your house, they're companies that are in your home country, makes you a little bit more comfortable taking the leap of faith to invest your savings into these companies. And having that added comfort is going to help you become a long-term investor because you're more comfortable with these companies that you know and you're familiar with. That's a very reasonable thing to do. So home bias is not rational, but it's very reasonable. And I think it's a completely fine thing for people to have. And so I think there are a lot of things in investing like that you can't explain on a spreadsheet. You can't rationalize it on a spreadsheet. But they're the right thing for you to do because they make you happy and they make you a little bit more comfortable. And they're giving you, if you're comfortable with your investing strategy, it's probably going to give you endurance. And endurance, just the ability to be a long-term investor, to be able to stick with it through the ups and downs, is the most critical aspect of investing.
So fantastic, Mark. Really an honor and privilege to have talked to you this evening, or rather, as far as you're concerned, this morning. What time is it there, by the way?
It's 4 a.m. It's very early.
4 a.m.
Kids,
and how cold is it?
So I am up early anyways, but this was an early one. But it's an honor to be here. I'm really happy to get to do this.
So thank you so much for being with us. Much obliged. Really appreciate your being with us.
Thank you so much.
Okay.